Let's be real, Hornby isn't just a brand name, it's practically a member of the British family. But what happened to Hornby? People are still wondering, how did the UK's iconic toy empire vanish? So, for a century, a Hornby set was taking over living room floors around the world. Everyone wanted one in their home. But here's the weird part. If you go look at a shelf right now, Hornby is still there. The trains are actually more detailed and high-tech than the ones your granddad was obsessing over. Still, this isn't a typical company goes bankrupt and disappears story. In fact, there was no giant explosion, no final factory fire, no dramatic game over screen. Instead, Hornby did something much more chilling. The brand survived, but the empire around it evaporated. It's like a ghost ship. The lights are on, the engines are humming, but the world it was built for has completely moved on. If you look at Hornby today, it doesn't look like a company that vanished. It looks like a survivor. The trains are still hitting the tracks. The iconic logo is still plastered on every box. And for the die-hard collectors, the details on these models is sharper than anything produced during the so-called golden years. This is exactly why the story is so easy to misread. The way this powerhouse actually lost its footing isn't as obvious as it looks at first. You have to go back to where the magic started, because Hornby was never just another toy company. It was the brainchild of Frank Hornby, the same genius who invented Meccano, and by the early 20th century, he had fundamentally rewired how kids played. These weren't just static toys you stared at on a shelf. They moved, they clicked, they hummed with life. Moreover, for a child, that was everything. You weren't just playing with a toy train. You were the absolute master of the railway. You had total ownership and total control over your own little universe. That one tiny shift in perspective turned Hornby into something way bigger than a product. It became an entire world. Once a brand infiltrates itself into family memories like that, it gains a level of psychological power that most companies today would literally kill for. It wasn't just a toy, it was a legacy in the making. Now, jump back to the 1960s, because this is where the story gets interesting. Hornby was already a name that felt more important than a normal toy brand. It's because it had history, trust, and that powerful connection to British childhood. A Hornby train set wasn't just something you opened and played with for 5 minutes. It was something you built around. You laid the track, adjusted the layout, controlled the engine, and created a small world where you were basically in charge of everything. That was the magic. But hidden inside that magic was the first problem, because Hornby was built for a slower kind of play. At the time, that was a strength, but later, it would become one of the hardest things to defend. By the middle of the century, Hornsby had become deeply stitched into the fabric of British identity. The trains looked British, the layouts felt British, and the entire hobby carried this warm, nostalgic feeling of patience, craft, and imagination. It was the ultimate national treasure, but hidden inside that massive success was the same trap that catches so many great brands, the identity trap. However, the company had a formula that worked for decades, so the safest move was to protect it. Of course, at the time, that made perfect sense, but that kind of thinking only works while the world around you stays still. In those days, the world was already going forward. The first major warning sign came in the 1960s, when Hornby's traditional models started looking vulnerable against cheaper, faster, and modern plastic competition. A competition called Triang, backed by the Lines brothers, understood exactly where the market was going. They wanted to build for a new generation of buyers who wanted something simple and budget-friendly. When Hornby ran into financial trouble in the 1960s, the takeover by Lines brothers looked like a rescue mission, but it actually was the end of Hornby's independence. The name survived, but the original identity was pushed aside, and the company was folded into a different commercial machine. By the 1970s and 80s, the toy market was changing in ways that didn't seem dangerous yet, but were actually fatal. Plastic manufacturing and new retail habits were making the market more aggressive. Hornby was no longer just protecting a product, they were protecting a memory, That sounds noble, but it's a business death sentence. Once you're tied too tightly to the past, you stop innovating. You keep leaning into what worked in 1955, even when the market in 1985 is screaming for something else. Then the 90s hit like a freight train. This was the decade when the digital divide really opened up. Entertainment was becoming faster and louder. Kids suddenly had video games, home computers, and eventually the internet. On the other hand, a Hornby train set required time, physical space, and extreme patience, while modern games give you instant action and adrenaline. You didn't need to build the world first. The world appeared the second you click start. The digital era didn't destroy Hornby overnight, but it just changed how people spend their time. It was a collision between analog friction and digital flow. This changed the DNA of play. Hornby's biggest strength had always been engagement, but engagement takes effort. For a new generation, that effort started to feel like an obstacle. Hornby didn't die overnight, but its emotional value shifted. It was no longer the must-have dream for every child. It was becoming a specific niche hobby for people who already spoke the language. Then, in the 2000s, Hornby tried to reclaim its glory by buying up legendary names like Airfix, Scalextric, and Corgi. On paper, it looked like they were building a new super empire. But here's the twist. Buying heritage brands is often just a way of doubling down on the past. You're collecting names people remember, not necessarily names people are using. It made the company look bigger, but it also made it heavier and more dependent on nostalgia. By the 2010s, that weight became too much to carry. The company was drowning in financial losses, supply chain nightmares in China, and a market that was shrinking every year. Ultimately, the 2017 takeover by Phoenix Asset Management was the final signal that the magic was over. Hornby was no longer a toy company, it was a turnaround project. The conversation shifted from childhood wonder to debt, margins, and inventory management. This led directly to 2025, when Hornby was delisted from the public market and went private. It was a symbolic abdication of the throne. So, what's the real post-mortem? Hornby wasn't killed by one rival or a bad manager. It was a slow-motion collision with a world that moved faster than its tracks could handle. The tragedy isn't that the brand vanished, but that it lost its place at the center. It's that it mattered so much in the past that it couldn't figure out how to own the future. Nostalgia became its greatest asset and its heaviest weight. The tracks are still there and the engines still run, but the empire has moved into the history books along with other nostalgia chasers like Airfix. Sometimes an empire does not end when the doors close. Sometimes it ends when it becomes a smaller version of itself, still alive, still loved, but no longer leading the world it helped create. Now the question is, do you think classic brands like Hornby can ever truly win over Gen Z, or are they now just for older folks? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more revealing content. Cheers!